Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Eruvin Daf Beis contains two primary discussions separated by a Mishnah. The first one is not a real Eruvin related sugya. It's about whether or not there is a chazaka shliach oiser shechusei. Can you assume if somebody has a job, he has a mission that he's assigned to, that he will do it? Can you rely that he accomplished it even if you don't know for a fact? Does that apply to an Isser D'Oraisa or not, where you need the shliach in order to do something so that you can avoid an Isser D'Oraisa? So that's a machlekes thing where we'll bring several proofs to either side, and along the way discuss a little hilchos meiser and demai. Then the Mishnah takes us back to the halachas of Eruvin and talks about what happens if you put an Eruvin high up in a tree where it's above 10 tvachim. Can you count that as your Eruv or not? So first of all, the Gemara says we have this machlekes. This is at the end of Daf Lamed Aleph, machlekes between Rav Nachman and Rav Sheshes. We have a rule that chazaka sheich oiser shechusei. You send somebody to do something, you're allowed to assume that he did it. And if his accomplishing his mission means that you can now do something and it won't be an Isser D'Oraisa, you could assume that it's okay, it's not a problem. So Rav Nachman and Rav Sheshes both agree that this applies to an Isser D'Arbanan. The question is, does it apply to an Isser D'Oraisa? So according to Rav Nachman, no, you cannot assume that Shliach did his job until you know for a fact, in order to rely on it to avoid an Isser D'Oraisa. According to Rav Sheshes, you can, even if it's an Isser D'Oraisa. So now the Gemara is going to bring three proofs. First one, we're not clear who's proving who. We have the two opinions understand the sugya each way, and we're not sure which way it went. Was it a proof and a response to Rav Sheshes, a proof to Rav Sheshes and a response by Rav Nachman, or a proof to Rav Nachman and the response by Rav Sheshes? The discussion is about the carbon ha'omer. The halacha is that grain which took root after the carbon omer is brought is forbidden until the next carbon omer is brought. And when the carbon omer is brought, which is on the second day of Pesach, once that carbon is brought, all grain which took root previously is now permitted. It switches from being called chadash, new grain, to being called yashan, old grain. Now, if you know that the carbon omer is brought, so fine, you know that it's brought, you can eat the grain. What if you're far from Yerushalayim, you don't know if it was brought or not? So we have a Mishnah that says that you're allowed to assume that it was brought from midday on, from chatzos. You're allowed to assume that it was already brought, and you don't have to know for a fact. You can assume that the Kahanim in Yerushalayim did their job, and now you're allowed to eat your grain which took root. Now this is a Isser D'Oraisa if they didn't bring it, and yet you're allowed to assume that they did. So you see clearly Shliach Oiser Shechusei even on Isser D'Oraisa. That's the version that it's a proof to Rav Sheshes, and on that Rav Nachman answers, nah. You're only allowed to assume it here because there's a Beis Din. There's a Beis Din who's responsible to make sure, there's a court that's responsible to make sure that it's brought. If you're relying on an individual shliach to do his job, that you can't rely on Isser D'Oraisa. According to the second version, Rav Nachman said this is a proof to me, because you see that here the only reason why you're allowed to rely on them is because there's a Beis Din, but if it would be an individual, you can't. On that, Rav Sheshes says, no, over here, you only need the Beis Din in order to make it permitted by half the day. Because you have a Beis Din, when it's half the day, you could assume that it was accomplished. If you wouldn't have a Beis Din, you could assume that it was accomplished at some point. You just wouldn't be able to tell which part of the day. You'd have to wait till the day's over in order to assume that the carbon was certainly brought and your grain is permitted. Okay, that's the first one. Now the Gemara has another proof. This is from a Brisa that says that if a woman is obligated to bring a carbon, woman could have to bring a carbon if she gave birth or if she was a zava. Either way, she would have to bring two birds. So what she used to do was she would put money in a special box that was set aside for that, and the kehanim would take the money and bring the carbon, and she doesn't have to be involved. All she has to do is put the money there, and she could assume that that the carbon was brought. She's allowed to go to the mikvah that evening, and then she could already eat kachim, holy food afterwards. Doesn't have to be concerned that she might still have tumah or that the carbon wasn't brought. So you see, again, there's the assumption that the Kohanim do their job. And this is also a question of an Isser D'Oraisa. This is clearly a proof to Rav Sheshes that the Kohanim do their job. So the Gemara says not a proof here. Again, there's a Beis Din. Rav Nachman will say that there's a Beis Din that's responsible for the activities of the Kohanim, and they make sure that all the money that was in the box has been spent on karbanos, and those karbanos are brought before the end of the day. Now it moves into its third and final proof, and this one's a bit more of a discussion. And this is a brisa about somebody who told his friend, you could go take some of my figs. So the question is, when the guy takes the figs, does he have to take meiser and truma from the figs, or could he assume that the owner took meiser and truma on it on his own because he didn't want him to end up eating forbidden figs? So the brisa says as follows: if he told him, the brisa says as follows: if he is eating it arai, meaning he's just standing there in the field and is eating them, he hasn't brought them into the house, so then it's not chayiv and meiser at all, so he doesn't need to worry about it. He doesn't have to take anything. If, however, he's going to harvest it and bring it into the house, so then we have a question: did the owner take meiser on these figs or not? Is the owner concerned that the person he allowed to eat his figs may be eating iser? He wants to make sure that he's not eating anything iser, so he took meiser on it on his own. So Gemara says as follows: if he didn't specify the amount of figs he could take, he just said to take as many figs as you want, then he certainly didn't take meiser for it, because we don't know, he doesn't know how many figs the guy is going to take, and therefore it's vadai not meiser, and that person has to take off meiser vadai with a bracha. He definitely has to take meiser from it. Now, if, however, he gave him a set amount, he said, here's a basket, fill up this basket. So now the owner knows how much he gave, and now the owner could take meiser. So what's the halacha? So the Gemara says, the brisa says as follows: if the guy's in Am Ha'aretz, if the owner's in Am Ha'aretz, so you can't rely on him ever that he took meiser, so then it's a suffix whether he took meiser or not, and the guy who's collecting the figs has to take off meiser as demai. He doesn't know whether the owner took off meiser for him or not. If, however, the owner is a Talmud Chacham, so now we have a machlokes between Rebbe and Rebbe's father, who was Rav Shimon ben Gamliel. Rebbe said, I say that you can assume he took off for sure. A Talmud Chacham would not allow somebody to be eating from his field in a situation where it's potentially that he is potentially eating Isser. And the Rebbe's words are as follows: you can for sure allow it because a Talmud Chacham would not allow an Am Ha'aretz, this is the key point, he's saying a Talmud Chacham would not allow an Am Ha'aretz to do an Isser, and therefore you could assume that he took Meiser for sure. Rav Shimon ben Gamliel says, no, you could assume that he for sure did not take Meiser, because we have a rule that Talmidei Chachamim never take Meiser on fruits in one place from fruits in a different place, because maybe some of those fruits don't exist at the time that you're taking the Meiser. There's a chazaka that they do not take Meiser Shalem and Amokav. Therefore, the Talmud Chacham somewhere else certainly did not take off Meiser on these figs that he's allowing this person to collect on his own. That's Rav Shimon ben Gamliel's position. The Gemara later explains that the Talmud Chacham taking off the Meiser on fruits which is not near him would be considered to be an Isser Kalila. It's a light Isser. The question is, would this Talmud Chacham prefer to violate this light Isser on his own in order that the Am Ha'aretz doesn't end up doing a bigger Isser of eating non-kosher tevel? Or would he prefer to say, listen, I'm not going to do a light Isser, and that Am Ha'aretz is his own problem to take care of the issue? So the Gemara says, first of all, we have a proof over here to Rav Sheshes, because everybody in this mission is agreeing that the Talmud Chacham is going to do his job. The only question is what the job is. Is he supposed to take off Meiser even though it's far away from the fruits that he's taking on, or is he supposed to say, well, I have to make sure to do it so that the Am Ha'aretz won't be over anything? But if it is his job, he's definitely going to do it. So the Gemara says that's a clear proof to Rav Sheshes. The Gemara answers it's not a proof, because over here it's not just that it's a mission. It's not a shlicha. It's not a job that he has. There's an assumption that the Talmid Chachamim do this. There's a chazaka. Talmid Chachamim do not allow something that is not meiser to leave their possession and have it somebody else exposed to an isser. So that's what the discussion over here is. Such a chazaka exists. The question is, does that chazaka stronger than the chazaka not to separate meiser and something far away, or is it weaker? But it's definitely not a question of shlichus over here. Now the Gemara wants to know, I don't understand, the person who's collecting the figs, he's an Am Ha'aretz, you called him. In the Sefer you said he's an Am Ha'aretz, but if he's an Am Ha'aretz, so then in the first case where you're discussing whether or not he has to take meiser or not, from if the owner is an Am Ha'aretz, you said then he has to take meiser. he's not going to listen to you take Meiser. And Amaretz doing interactions with another Amaretz is going to assume that he did whatever he is supposed to do. They're both Amaratzim. Why would he listen to you in halach over here? So Gemara says, so that must have been a Talmud Chacham then. The one who's collecting it must have been a Talmud Chacham. The Gemara says, but you just called him an Amaretz. You just said that a Talmud Chacham would not allow an Amaretz to do an Isser. So what's going on? So Gemara says the case is where he's an Amaretz, but there's a different Talmud Chacham who's listening. Meaning the first case, he's a Talmud Chacham, where we said that the owner is an Amaretz, and we're telling him we're telling the collector to take Meiser misafek. So there, in that situation, the collector is a Talmud Chacham. That's why he's going to listen to us. In the second case, the collector is an Amaretz. And you're right, that Amaretz is not interested in what we have to say. But there's a different Talmud Chacham who's listening, and he himself is going to end up partaking of this as well, with permission, obviously. And the question is, what should he do? What should he assume? And that's what we're discussing. Should he assume that since a Talmud Chacham allowed an Amaretz to take, he obviously took Meiser because he will not allow the Amaretz to do an Isser, or not necessarily, it could be that the Talmud Chacham would rather not take Meiser on something which wasn't near him on fruits that are Shalom and Hamokef. Okay, we now move on to the next Mishnah, and this is back to the halachas of Eruvin. Again, we're discussing an Eruv Tchumen here, and that means that you're setting aside food somewhere distant from where you are, and you want that food to be there when Shabbos begins, and the moment the Shabbos begins and you have a significant amount of food there, that food is considered your permanent residence for Shabbos, and therefore that is the center of your 2,000 Amot Chum in each direction, and this allows you to walk all the way there and another 2,000 amas past that. So in order for the Eruv to work, it has to be accessible to you. You have to be able to get to it on Shabbos. So the Mishnah discusses two cases. First of all, if it's high up in a tree, and second of all, if it's deep down in a pit. High up in a tree, the Mishnah says it's got to be within the bottom 10 tfachim. If it's above 10 tfachim, it doesn't count. It's not a good Eruv. But in the pit, it could be any height. It doesn't matter how deep the pit is. Okay, so now the Gemara discusses the tree case. Now, the issue here is as follows. We know that there's a halacha that Rishus Harabim extends from the floor up to 10 tfachim. Above 10 tfachim is considered Rishus HaYachid. If you're in a place which is a Rishus HaYachid altogether, so then the Rishus HaYachid goes all the way up to the sky. It goes from the floor all the way up. But if you're in a Rishus Harabim, the Rishus Harabim stops at a height of 10 tfachim. So Gemara is assuming that that's the issue over here. That's why if the Eruv is above 10 tefachim, it's a problem. So the Gemara tries to figure out exactly how this works. The Gemara says that Rav Chibar Abba, Rav Asi, and Rav Bar Nosson were sitting with Rav Nachman, and they were discussing this halach over here, and they said, hold on a second, let's try to figure out what's happening. What is the region where this tree is? If it's Rosh Hashanah, so there's no problem. What's the issue? Why should it be no good if the Eruv is placed higher than 10 tefachim? What's the difference? Wherever you are, you're in the same Rishus as the Eruv. You're in Rosh Hashanah. The Eruv is in Rosh Hashanah. It's all Rosh Hashanah. It goes all the way up to the sky. No issue. So it must be talking about where it's in Rosh Hashanah. The area is at Rosh Hashanah. So now, furthermore, where are you planning on spending Shabbos? If you're planning on spending Shabbos in the tree above 10 tefachim, so then, again, what's the problem? You and the Eruv are in the same place. You're both in the tree, and you're in the same Rishus. It's Rishus HaYachid, even though the area is Rishus HaYachid, but above 10 tefachim is a Rishus HaYachid. You're in the Rishus HaYachid because you're above 10 tefachim. The Eruv is in the Rishus HaYachid because you're above 10 tefachim. You're both in the same Rishus. You're both in the tree, so it's accessible to you. So why should it be an issue? So that can't be the case either. The case must be where you're planning on spending Shabbos on the floor. And the Eruv, the Mishnah says, if it's put above 10 tefachim from the ground in the tree, so now you can't get to it. You're in Rosh Hashanah, it's in Rosh Hashanah. You cannot go in there and carry it out to where you are. It's not in the same Rosh as you, and therefore I cannot establish an Eruv for you. The Gemara says, but there's two problems with this. Well, the Gemara has one problem. Rashi has a second problem. The problem the Gemara asks is that how could you get the Eruv off the tree? Even if it's below 10 tefachim, even if it's below 10 tefachim, where we said that the Eruv is good because you're in the Rosh Hashanah and the Eruv is in Rosh Hashanah, you're not allowed to take something off a tree on Shabbos. That's called Mishnamish Be'ilon. So you still can't get to the Eruv. So why should it be good if you and the Eruv are in the same below 10 tefachim Rishos? That's what the Gemara asks. And the Gemara answers, we're talking about the opinion of Rebbe. Taking something off a tree is an Isser D'Rabbanon, and the Erev goes into effect during Bein Hashmashos, when it's twilight, when Shabbos is just beginning. And the halacha is that Rebbe holds the halacha is that there are no Isurei D'Rabbanon when it is Bein Hashmashos. Bein Hashmashos is anyway a rabbinical issue, it's anyway a time of Safek. Now, you don't have to worry about an Isser D'Rabbanon during the moment of Bein Hashmashos. Therefore, when Bein Hashmashos happens and Shabbos begins, that Erev is accessible to you. The only problem is, again, D'Rabbanon, and there is no D'Rabbanon at that moment because it's only Bein Hashmashos. Since the Erev is accessible to you, then that's where your Tchum is established. That's the center of your Tchum. Now, afterwards, it becomes inaccessible to you. Afterwards, who cares? The Tchum is already established. It only has to be accessible to you at the time the Shabbos begins, and since it is in a since the only Isser is Midrabanan, the fact that there's an Isser there is not a problem during Bein Hashmashos. Okay, this would seem to be a rule according to Rebbe that whenever the separation, the problem between you reaching your Erev is only D'Rabbanan, it's not an issue because it only has to be okay during Bein Hashmashos, and that's not a problem. Now, the Gemara says that Rav Nachman was very happy with this. He said Yasher Koyach for this, and Shmuel also said very good. He likes the pshat. The Gemara asked, "Well, are you so pleased with this pshat? Is it such a great pshat? It sounds to me like you had to twist in order to get to it." And the Gemara asks, "What are you telling me? We had to twist to get to it. You have to twist to say the same thing." So the Gemara changes the comment. It wasn't that you had to twist. The Gemara was saying, "Not my pasrisu, but my kavisu." Did you establish this as the permanent pshat in the Gemara? Does this go into the Messiah, the tradition as to how to understand this Mishnah? And the Gemara says yes, and the Gemara records this for generations. Rav Nachman, Shmuel, this is the halacha. We're discussing this Mishnah is Rebbe's opinion, and the reason why it's not a problem if the Erev is below 10 Tvachim is because Bein Hashmashos, there is no Isur D'Rabbanan, and the Isur D'Rabbanan of taking something off a tree does not apply. Okay. Now Rava says a halacha. This entire thing is only if the tree is standing outside a city and it's not even close to a city. It's not within the tchum of a city. Tchum, I don't mean the 2,000 amos of the city. Tchum, I mean what's called the expansion zone around the city itself. The city is defined as the area where all the houses are, and as far away from the city as you go, where you still have houses within 70 amos approximately of each other. As long as you're within that zone, it's all considered to be part of the city. And we have a rule that within a city and within that zone, it's considered filled with dirt up till 10 Tvachim. We view the land as raised up till 10 Tvachim as far as this particular halacha, that where you're planning on spending Shabbos, that's your zone. So if it would be within the city or within the city's expansion zone, and wherever you're planning on spending Shabbos, even if you're planning on spending Shabbos on the ground, it's viewed halachically as if it's filled, and therefore you are actually spending Shabbos above 10 Tvachim, and therefore this halacha wouldn't apply, because it would be considered like you are above 10 Tvachim, and therefore it's no issue. You and the Erev are in the same Rishos, you're both in Rishos Yachid. This must be talking about where you and the Erev are in where the tree is outside of the city, outside of the expansion zone. Therefore, if you're spending Shabbos on the ground, then you're in a different Rishos, so you're below 10 Tvachim while the Erev is above 10 Tvachim. So Gemara has a question, so if so, then you should say the same thing for every Erev, whether it's in the ground or out of the ground. If you have this halacha that it's filled up, as long as it's within a Rishos Yachid, an enclosed area like a city, or the city expansion zone is considered filled, so then every Erev should be considered filled, because we know that there's halacha that every Erev is considered like it has 4 amos around it that are a Rishos HaYachid, that are a closed zone. So any Erev, even a tree miles away from anything, should be considered an enclosed zone, and you should be allowed to consider it filled, and therefore you are as if you're spending your Shabbos above 10 Tvachim in the same Rishos as the Erev. Even if the Erev is above 10 Tvachim, what's the issue? That the Gemara answers, it's talking about where the Erev is on a branch of the tree sticking outside this 4 amma zone of the tree. You're right, the 4 amma zone around the tree is considered filled, but here the Erev is on a branch that is outside that 4 amma zone, and therefore you, if you're spending Shabbos on the ground, are not on the same level as the Erev. You're not on the same Rishos the Erev, and you can't get to it in Shabbos, and that's why the Erev doesn't.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.